They say that 1 in every 1,000 people is special, and 1 in every million, an unparalleled genius. Nascal is 1 in a billion. Since childhood, he showed an inordinate talent to create, a skill that surpassed even the greatest masters of the world. With such a gift, there was never any doubt that, if he wanted, he could have become anything that he desired. But Nascal did not care for such things, for his only passion was the marionettes. When he was a little boy, his parents took him to a theater, where he saw for the first time what would become his obsession. These simple figures of wood and metal, artificial beings posing as people, fascinated him in an incomprehensible way. And it was then, at such an early age, he decided to devote his life to them. Year after year, Nascal learned everything about their construction and handling, developing unique methods to give them more realism and mobility. With time, his works became incomparable, so perfect that it was difficult to distinguish them from living beings. His marionettes were valued as masterworks and appreciated everywhere. And only now, upon turning 25, is Nascal truly pleased. Everyone recognizes that he is the greatest artist in the world. Nascal entered the hall where the Council of Brax was taking place. The greatest artists and creators of the world met once every decade under those walls. Different civilizations, even non-human creatures, were there to show the wonders they had created over the years. Naturally, only the very best could attend, those whose fame had crossed all frontiers. For many of them, just having been invited represented an honor, but to Nascal, it was quite the opposite. They should feel honored by his attendance. The puppet master walked through the room, trying to pass unnoticed. He paid little attention to several uninspired works that only reminded him of why he was superior to everyone else. Nascal smiled ruefully. Although he did not expect too much from others, he had wished to find something to at least rival with his talent. Lost in those thoughts, a distant word caught his attention. Someone had mentioned Gaudeamus, the creator of wonders, whose fame had reached even Nascal's ears. Apparently, he had also been invited, and a group of people were talking to him not too far away. Interested by his fame, Nascal approached him to share some anecdotes with a fellow genius. To his surprise, the legendary creator was much younger than he had expected, and was quick to shake his hand and exchange a polite greeting. Nascal was about to ask about the works he was exhibiting in the council, when the whole room became silent. Everyone whispered that Gaudeamus had just arrived. At that moment, the confused Nascal understood what they meant, and a chill of terror ran through his spine. The person he was talking with was not a living being, but a doll. Work of Gaudeamus was what he had heard the people say before. Even if it was only for a moment, the mere idea that he had not noticed such a thing overwhelmed the mind of the puppet master. Frantically, his eyes began to gaze closely at all the works exhibited by Gaudeamus. The mere sight of them burned his retinas, but at the same time, he was unable to look away. The feeling of anxiety that oppressed his chest grew until it became pain. He even had trouble breathing in the same room that stored such wonders. Unable to wait anymore, he staggered out of the room and did not stop running until he was outside. Then, Nascal cried and laughed as hard as he could. He had been blind all this time. In his egotism, he thought he was on top of the world when he was only standing on a small hill. Only in that moment did he realize that his work was far from having reached its full potential. That night would change his life completely. He would create greater works. He would surpass Gaudeamus, surpass them all. From that moment, his obsession would be perfection. Nascal suddenly awoke. For months, he had been unable to sleep well, and that night had been particularly bad, something which he blamed on the emotion of being so close to finishing his work. Washing his face, he noticed how terrible he looked in the mirror and thought that very soon he would have to be ready to return to society. Nascal was unsure of how much time had passed since he had visited the Council of Brax. After that night, he invested his vast fortune in creating a secluded mansion away from the civilized world. A huge and well-equipped workshop in which he could devote body and soul to his work, free from distractions. It had been years, or maybe even decades, since the last time he had contact with another human being. But loneliness meant little to him. All that mattered was that he was close to reaching his goal. Over the years, just improving his creative talent wasn't enough for Nascal. His goal was much higher. He devoted day after day to research the same process Gaudeamus developed to make his works, becoming an unrivaled expert in lost science and supernatural rituals. With such unusual tools, he managed to create countless animated puppets, which were able to move by themselves, the very ones that now protected his mansion and took care of its maintenance. But they were all just prototypes for his definitive work, the ultimate puppet. An artificial being so perfect, it would not be aware that it was not alive. Nascal solemnly went down to the heart of his workshop, where his most valued masterpiece waited for him. On the table was a body. Any observer would think without a doubt that it was a true human being. It had the same appearance as its creator, as identical as 2 drops of water. The master puppeteer smiled. In his next encounter with Gaudeamus, it would be his marionette that greeted him. An ironic joke that only he would be able to understand. After reviewing the status of the project for hours, Nascal determined that it was only a matter of days until it was finished. Only a few pieces were missing, which should be stored in his secondary workshop. With unusual anxiety, he walked to the north wing in search of them. It had been a long time since he had visited that area of the mansion, and he was not even really sure of why he stopped going there. Upon entering the room, the master puppeteer was struck by the terrible state of the place. He didn't remember having forsaken it for so long. Without giving it too much thought, Nascal walked to where the pieces were stored, but he saw something in his way which puzzled him. There, sitting in the workshop, was a corpse, holding the parts Nascal had come for. His flesh, rotted and dried, was in pretty bad shape, suggesting that it had been in that place for a long time. Surprised, Nascal approached to examine the body, but before he could do so, the puppet master became completely paralyzed with terror. Because, despite being worn and wasted, there was no doubt. The corpse had exactly the same face as him. What was a human being? What exactly was he? Nascal didn't know for how long, years perhaps. He had asked the same questions without finding an answer. Was the dead body in the workshop the real Nascal? But if it was, why did it hold the parts needed to complete the project? The puppet master had his body analyzed several times over the years, trying to find something that could help him determine if he was a man or a marionette. In his research, Nascal severed some of his limbs, replacing them with metal implants, an irony that even he could see. Desperate, he began to consider using other humans as guinea pigs for research. However, after all of his sacrifices, he was still not even one step closer to finding the truth. But what if none of that mattered? People, puppets, what if there had never been any difference from the start? Vaguely, the consciousness of the being that was once Nascal awakened. He looked at the world through the hundreds of eyes that were his terminals, independent puppets connected to his senses. The entity had witnessed the passage of time with a perspective that only immortality could grant, and was satisfied with the outcome. The only thing that he came to regret was the death of Gaudeamus, who passed away before he could see how his legend was surpassed. However, in the end, that didn't really matter either. It was the fate of all those beings who were unable to reach Nascal's heights. More than 200 years ago, he was forced to flee from the continent, chased by the Inquisition when his true nature was discovered. From that moment on, he traveled from one place to another until he made his residence in the lost civilizations of the depths of the jungle, since he found their old creative techniques interesting. There, he rebuilt his mansion and continued with his work, creating beings that transgress the line between the living and artificial. To ensure that no one could oppose him, in that period Nascal obtained the power to overcome any threat. He surrounded himself with a legion of extremely efficient combat marionettes and modified his body over and over until all that was left of its original form was a part of his brain and his spinal cord. Its size grew disproportionately, gaining a height of over 90 feet, and he armed himself with all sorts of artifacts of enormous destructive power. Unfortunately, producing enough energy to move such a structure was very complex, so he was forced to power his generators with hundreds of souls. This caused his personal power to increase exponentially until he became a vast, living weapon. Now he went on with the same enthusiasm that he had when he was just a small child, with the sole aim of creating new puppets, perfect creatures that, like him, transcend the limits of life itself, and he will continue to do so until the world is ready to change.